Yep.
Hello everybody, my name is Carla Keith. Thanks for joining us today. I'm the Communications Manager here at the CRCNA. Before we start, I just wanted to let everybody know that we will be recording this afternoon's session, so if there's anything that you would like to go back to at a later time, you can certainly do that. And similarly, just be aware that if you are using the Zoom function to chat or have comments, that those comments and discussions will be captured in the recording as well. So just be mindful of that. Before we start the session, we'll do a quick ring around the table. You'll see some staff sitting in front of you here. We've got the team from Oz Industry with us, and Tom will be presenting to us today. And I'll let everybody introduce themselves quickly, and then I'll be handing over to Tom. He'll be sharing his screen for you and walking you through the presentation. If you do have questions, again, we have the chat function available to us. So I'll leave it up to Tom if he wants to take questions as we go on, or if there'll just be a session at the end to capture those comments or questions. So I'll hand over to you, Tom, to introduce yourself.
Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Tom Gilbert. I'm one of 4 national compliance managers that work within the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, as we're now known. Within the Research and Development Tax Incentive program within that department. I'm very pleased today to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about that program, which I'll do in due course.
Excellent. Kristen, did you want to introduce yourself? Dina, just because people can see you.
Hi, I'm Dina Lillicombe with CRCNA as a project officer.
Kristen Nunn, Queensland Project Manager, CRCNA.
Kay Strong, Oz Industry Regional Manager, North Queensland.
And Renee Chilton from Oz Industry, North Queensland.
Jed Matt, CEO of CRCNA.
Just thought we'd share everyone our names, given that they can see us, so they knew who they were looking at. I'm just going to now share our screen, but before we do, does anybody have, are there any questions or anything like that that anyone would like to sort of ask initially before we switch over to shared screen? No? Okay, all right, I'm just going to move into Tom's presentation. I'll swap seats with you as well.
Oh, okay, no worries. Thanks, Carl. Super, right, well, so thanks very much, Carla and Jed and Kristen for having me here today to tell you a little bit more about the Research and Development Tax Incentive. When we convene these information sessions across the country, it's customary for us to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, which I'd like to do now. Clearly, we're all on different pieces of land today, so I will need to leave it at that in terms of acknowledging the traditional owners, but certainly we'd like to extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joined us today. And with that, we'll move into our presentation. So, Carla mentioned earlier that you might have questions on the way through. Certainly, please type them. I may actually need to rely on someone who is a little bit more conversant with the technology we're using today to access those questions as they arise. Certainly, if they're relevant to the issue that we're talking about at that point in time, I'm more than happy to stop. What is usually the case, though, is that there's a sort of quite a few questions that accumulate at the end. So don't feel compelled to ask questions as we go along. There's certainly enough content to keep us occupied for a good little while. I understand we had around an hour and a half to 2 hours to play with. Is that correct? And certainly that does sound like a lot of time to start with. But I've done these information sessions over time and have found myself very easily filling that amount of time with conversation about the program. So I suppose we're just using our mouse today just to advance through the slides. Great. Yeah, so we'll just move through the slides. Yep, restrooms are where you know they are. Clearly, this presentation is designed for delivery in person. But basically, yeah, just looking at the high-level objectives of this session, it's basically to help you understand as potential users of the program what it is, how you can self-assess and apply. Certainly there is a lot of information available that goes into a lot more detail than I'm able to go into today. And at the end of the session today, I'd like to sort of use the screen to help navigate you to the correct part of our business.gov.au website, which contains the information that you can access to further inform yourselves about the program and travel that journey of self-assessment and hopefully register for the program. So I suppose just as a caveat from the outset, I do need to outline that this is a presentation designed to provide guidance and education. We're not in a position to provide you with a very direct and specific call on whether or not a particular activity you might have is eligible, unless you access the relevant process within our program to do that, which I will discuss later today. So the information today is not intended to be comprehensive or to constitute legal advice. Just have to put that caveat out there to start us off. But with that said, I would like the presentation today to be as meaningful and as information rich as it can be. So in terms of where we are wanting to head, or at least where I'd like to head with the presentation today, we're sort of looking at 5 elements. Firstly, what is the R&D Tax Incentive as an industry assistance program? I'd like to talk a little bit about how businesses self-assess their own eligibility, because that is an aspect of the program. It is an entitlement program that operates on a self-assessment regime. We'll talk a little bit about the record-keeping requirements for the program, some of the compliance or integrity assurance activities that we as industry get involved in, and talk to you about how to register. So, moving into, at a very high level, what the R&D Tax Incentive is. Firstly, I just need to say it's not a grant. A lot of people will call it a grant. They'll call it the R&D grant. They'll be talking to each other, say, oh, you've got that R&D grant. And what they're talking about is the R&D Tax Incentive. It is not a grant. It is an entitlement program. It encourages eligible R&D activities by providing a tax offset after companies or participants in the program have self-assessed their own eligibility for that program. So it's a program that there's a specific legislation about. So the program is governed by both the Income Tax Assessment Act 1997 and the Industry Research and Development Act 1986. So it's a program that's been around for a little bit and is going to be around for some time to come. Changing legislation is a pretty slow process. So in terms of being able to rely on the R&D Tax Incentive as a program that is going to have some level of persistence or some longevity, I think that's something that companies can do. The only other point on this slide that I haven't made yet is that it is jointly administered by ourselves in Oz Industry and the ATO, and we'll sort of go into the differences between Oz Industry's role and the ATO's role in due course. In a nutshell, Oz Industry looks after the issues around registration and activity eligibility, so we're concerned with the qualitative nature of the activities, and the ATO looks after receiving the tax returns from the companies and then any subsequent audits or expenditure issues that might arise. So we look after activities, they look after expenditure. That's sort of a quick and easy way to think about that. So the headline, what is the benefit of participating in the program? So it provides a benefit in 2 tiers. Firstly, for companies that have got an aggregated turnover of less than 20 million. And for those companies, the benefit is a 43.5% refundable tax offset. For companies that have got a turnover of over 20 million, then the benefit drops a little to 38.5% and is a non-refundable tax offset. So just talking that through a little, if you're a company that was less than 20 million in turnover and you were to register $100,000 worth of eligible research and development expenditure, instead of claiming it as a normal company deduction, you would instead claim it as an R&D notional deduction, and you would receive, come tax time, a credit of 43.5%. Just see that there's a question come in here, which I'll address just as soon as we've got through the slide on benefits.
Right.
So for example, a business spends $100,000 on eligible research and development. If they're under $20 million and they are in profit, say for example they've got a $50,000 tax bill, then $43,500 will come off that tax bill. It will be a tax offset. Importantly, if that business is in loss and doesn't have a tax bill, the tax office will pay that business $43,500. That's if they're spending $100,000 on research and development. So if you're a business that's in loss and you're doing eligible R&D, your turnover is less than $20 million, then you can, and you are interested in doing research and development in order to improve your competitive advantage in the market you operate in, then you can register for this program and receive 43.5% of the money that you spend as a refund at tax time. If your business is a larger business and turns over more than $20 million, then the refundable element of that disappears, so you would not receive a cash refund. The benefit rate drops to 38.5%, and given that it's non-refundable, if the business is in loss and is over $20 million in turnover, then that offset is able to be carried forward into future income years and claimed as an offset of tax in the future. So that's the benefit of the tax incentive. It's a powerful benefit, and particularly the benefit associated with loss-making companies that are doing eligible research and development is an attractive one, and certainly the tax incentive, the research and development tax incentive, does play a big role in the financing picture of many of our startups and companies that are yet to turn a profit. So we might just see what that question was, with a view to seeing whether or not that was something to address now or later. Yes, we're getting to, okay. Yep. Okay, so most grazing enterprises, companies, are not eligible to apply. Yep, we would like to apply for a ruling from the ATO on industry on setting up a new company to collect R&D rules from grazing enterprises and trading partnerships that are not companies. The new company would manage the interaction with the R&D providers. That is something that is very useful to talk about, but I think if we were to explore that in any detail right now, we would, I think, derail the presentation in terms of its generic appeal. So if we could take that one, not necessarily offline, but to perhaps discuss at the end, and if necessary, discuss offline as well. Certainly, the point that's made there by Marie is a valid one. Businesses do need to be an incorporated entity to apply, so trusts are not eligible. Therefore, many agricultural businesses are likely not to be eligible because of that. So what's being proposed here, which is a special purpose vehicle, may be a way to get around that. Certainly, there's some provisions that the ATO look at, which is on whose behalf the research and development is being conducted. So it's not extraordinarily straightforward, but certainly something to consider. So thank you, Marie, for that question, and certainly very happy to talk about that later. So we must keep moving.
Yep.
So refundable tax. So how will we do? Okay, great. So the process, the registration process, it's a cycle, and we very much hope that the cycle starts with the business actively considering that it's doing R&D, planning, and then planning its record-keeping activities to capture that R&D, so that it's in a position to self-assess its research and development against the guidelines and make a registration with Oz Industry within 10 months of the end of the income year within which that research and development is conducted. So this is a retrospective program. Businesses conduct the R&D first, self-assess their eligibility, fill in a registration form, lodge it with Oz Industry, get a number from us, put the number in their company tax return with the ATO, and access the benefit through the tax system. It's an annual cycle, and it needs to be repeated every year that a registrant or a participant in the program would like to participate. So the thing to point out here before we move on is that registration with Oz Industry is not a determination of eligibility of the activities being registered. There are simply far too many entities that register for the research and development tax incentive for us to provide that level of assurance up front. And so we do rely on businesses to self-assess their eligibility, and we conduct follow-up activities to assure, or attempt to assure the integrity of the program after the fact. There is a move though to try and do more of what we do up front and provide companies with a bit more certainty. It's certainly a move that I welcome, and to the extent that we can, we would like to do that. However, it does remain the fact that that is impossible for us to do with the number of registrants that lodge without delaying the issue of registration numbers unnecessarily. So annual cycle, think about the R&D first, self-assess, lodge your application, get a number and lodge it with the ATO when you put your company tax return in, and repeat every year. Okay, so self-assessment, is my business eligible? Now this is where his query comes in. This is a slide that talks about entity eligibility, and I'm very aware that in the agricultural sector there are many businesses that are not structured as an incorporated entity but are structured as a trading trust, and that is a bit of an issue when it comes to the R&D tax incentive. Certainly, there are agricultural businesses that have registered for the R&D tax incentive by incorporating a company on the side of their trust. Certainly, though, they do need to be cautious and take some pretty good advice from their advisors in relation to how to structure that arrangement, so that the work that is being done is being conducted for the company and not for the trust, because that's a key test that the ATO looks for. So, just to run through the slide here, eligible entities are incorporated under Australian law or incorporated under foreign law, but Australian residents for income purposes, incorporated under foreign law, and a resident of the country with which we've got a double tax agreement, including a definition of permanent establishment, and carrying on a business in Australia through that permanent establishment. And the other thing here at the bottom of the slide, which is reasonably important, is that there's a minimum eligible spend of $20,000 per year. That's if you want to register activities conducted by you. If you'd like to register less than that and still access the R&D tax incentive, it's still open to you to do so by one of our registered service providers who provides research and development services to smaller businesses, and doing an R&D tax incentive registration via one of those organisations is certainly a way to register smaller amounts of research and development expenditure than that $20,000. Okay, moving on. Is my business eligible? We've dealt with. Now we'll move to potentially, the part of the program that Oz Industry spends most of its time and attention on, which is activity eligibility. So, companies think in terms of projects. I mean, I think we all in our lives think in terms of projects, and that's quite natural. It's quite appropriate, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's a whole field of endeavour called project management, because thinking in terms of projects is a great way to think. Unfortunately, that's not entirely congruent with the way the research and development tax incentive legislation is drafted, which focuses on individual activities. The legislation talks about core activities and supporting activities, core R&D activities and supporting R&D activities. And they, as you can see there on the graphic on the right, are sub-elements of an overall project, which could quite easily have other activities which are not eligible for the R&D tax incentive. So in a nutshell, core activities are the experimental activities that are at the heart of a project. That's where you're exploring the unknown that nobody's explored before. That's where you've got the nut that you're trying to crack. And then you have supporting activities that hang off that, but are directly related to that. And then there are other activities which may be along the lines of, I don't know, providing, hot plants to ensure that the scientists involved in your project have got good mental health on the way through their project, and where there is not really a direct and relatively immediate link to the conduct of those experiments. So it's just useful to think of the concept that within a project, not all activity will be eligible for the R&D tax incentive. And that is because legislative well, legislation, or the R&D definition in the legislation is very, very narrow. If we look at this graphic, it's sort of another way to describe it. You've got the larger circle there, which is sort of ordinary business activities, which is sort of quite self-explanatory. Then you've got the lighter blue coloured circle there, which is the layperson's definition of research and development. And then within that, there's a smaller subset of activities which are legislative R&D. And as you'll see as we step into the definition, it's a bit of a narrow definition. And I think it's been drafted that way just to ensure that the significant amount of money that the government spends on subsidising this work is actually focused on high value work that has the potential to really unlock new sources of competitive advantage and position the Australian companies that participate in the program for success, not only here in Australia, but on a global stage. So it's a high bar for a reason.
Last question.
Certainly.
How do you distinguish between what would be legislative R&D and common definition R&D? Like if it's self-assessed, I might think that it's legislative.
Yep.
Is there a way to measure that, or?
Certainly, we'll get into that in the next couple of slides, because the sort of the glib and sort of rather unhelpful answer to that is it's anything that's not covered by the definition.
Okay.
But you'll see that the definition does give you some guidance in its own right. Yeah, and maybe your question will be answered in the next couple of slides. If it's not, I'm happy to revisit it.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. Here's the legislation. Time for me to get extremely excited. I'm so excited now, I can't describe it. Core R&D activities. This is the heart of the R&D tax incentive, in my view, because at the heart of every claim that is made in the R&D tax incentive is an activity that meets this definition, or should be an activity that meets this definition. As we talked about in this slide earlier, we've got core activities and supporting activities. In the legislation, they're referred to as core R&D activities and supporting R&D activities. And this is a definition from the Income Tax Assessment Act. And they are experimental activities whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance using existing knowledge, but can only be determined by applying a systematic progression of work that's based on the principles of established science and proceeds from hypothesis to experiment, observation and evaluation, and leads to logical conclusions, and that are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. Shiver up my spine, having read that. But in all seriousness, this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of eligibility for the tax incentive. So, an outcome that cannot be known or determined in advance using existing knowledge. What does that mean? That means that if you're doing something, a competent professional in the field with access to journals, peer-reviewed websites, communities of practice, etc., would not know the outcome of what you were doing based on the current state of the art. That can only be determined by applying a systematic progression of work that's based on the principles of science, proceeds from hypothesis, experiment, observation, evaluation, etc. That's important too, because some things have an outcome that cannot be known or determined in advance using existing knowledge, but they can be determined by doing something other than that. So that can be determined, particularly in the software space, by adopting a standard software development methodology that's not organised and is just trialling a whole series of approaches for fitness for purpose. So this is really what it's about. So
make sure you got the correct R&D question you're going to ask them about if you're going to ask a research and development question, you need to make sure that it's something that cannot be answered, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. So if you can pay someone who's a competent professional in the field to tell you the answer, then it's not an unknown outcome. And new knowledge is a different concept to that. It's a bit broader because we acknowledge that some companies might be doing something for the purpose of generating new knowledge to them, but it's not new to the world. So you can have companies that are doing things that are not eligible with A, but eligible with B, but you need to meet both parts. So look, we'll just unpack this a little bit. So because this is so key, I'm going to revert now to my speaking notes for this element of the presentation, because it is really quite crucial that we send a standardised message in relation to this, because this is, as I say, it's the heart of eligibility for the program. So the legislation requires that the outcome cannot be known or able to be determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience. It can only be determined by applying the systematic progression of work based on scientific principles and following the relevant scientific method. The requirement for the scientific method establishes that the threshold for the unknown outcome and the degree of uncertainty that the eligible experiment must seek to address. That wasn't written well. Experiments that have an outcome that's already publicly or commercially available anywhere in the world at the time of the activity is conducted, they won't be eligible for R&D activities. So it's a new to world threshold. This unknown outcome thing. So I suppose as an example here. So it's also true if a competent professional in the field knows or can figure out or predict the outcome of an experiment. So for example, just to try and unpack the difference here that you were sort of asking about before, if you mix blue and yellow paint, from previous experience, it's known, and therefore you can predict that you'll produce green paint, right? Okay. However, while it might be unknown what shade of green is the preferred shade, experimenting with different proportions of each paint colour to achieve the desired shade isn't going to meet the requirement of unknown outcome for the purposes of this experiment, because you know you're going to get green, you just don't know what shade of green you're going to get. And so that's an example of something, and it's quite a sort of a low level example of something that wouldn't meet the test.
Can I extrapolate that out to research that we're doing?
Yep.
Trialling crops that are known to be able to be grown in the world,
yep,
but have never been grown in this part of the world, and we don't know if we can grow them and how commercial that.
Yep.
Is that new science? Yeah.
So I'm pleased you asked that, because it's really relevant to, I think, to the audience here today. But it's also something that's come up quite recently. So certainly, I think that would meet part of the definition. So conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. The new knowledge being generated there would be understanding whether or not grown in Australia, in Australian conditions.
In Northern Australia.
In Northern Australia. And so it then becomes, in my mind, a question of whether or not the outcome of that would be unknowable to a competent professional in the field, and whether or not the only way to determine that outcome, whether it could be grown in Northern Australia or not, was to conduct a systematic progression of work. So if you could talk about what aspects of, or if you could understand or articulate what aspects of growing that crop in Northern Australia made or set up such uncertainty around whether or not it would succeed, and you could sufficiently demonstrate that no competent, and this is a difficult thing to, because it's hard to demonstrate a lack of knowledge. So it is a difficult thing to demonstrate. But if there are agricultural experts available who are happy to vouch for your word to say, well, there's no knowledge around whether or not this can be done in this environment, and these are some of the reasons why it's so uncertain. And that's the only way to find out whether or not it can be done is to conduct a systematic progression of work. Then you'd have to argue that you're coming very close to meeting that test.
Right.
But I would say that doing it on a whole of farm basis, to say, okay, we're going to plant, hundreds of hectares of this,
That's not systematic.
indicates that there is a low level of uncertainty around it, because you wouldn't invest that much money to grow it. So trial plots, yes. A section of a farm, yes, or an experimental property, yes. But if you're sporadic cropping, if they just go, okay, we're going to use a different type of crop here, and we're going to just do the entire farm because we know it's going to work, we just don't know how well, then that's not in the realm of eligible. And there's a specific taxpayer alert that the ATO and Aus Industry have issued on whole farm claims in the agriculture sector, which I'd like to get into later in the presentation if we could. Okay, so any other questions that Deborah has asked? The advice our company's received is that if our R&D expenditure has been included as a cash contribution used to leverage a research grant from a government source, we cannot then claim the R&D tax incentive, as it is effectively claiming a double benefit. Is this correct? You're in the realm there, Deborah, of the clawback provisions. And that's something that is a little bit technical, that the ATO is the subject matter expert on, but that I can provide you with some signposts to get further information on. In a nutshell, contributions of R&D tax incentive rebates can be used for matching funding against other government grants. And if those government grants are in respect of totally separate activities to those that were registered under the tax incentive, the clawback provisions shouldn't apply because they, the activities are different and it's not double dipping. If it's the same, then there is a formula that the tax office applies to reduce, but not totally reduce, the benefit associated with the tax incentive claimed in respect of that activity. So that again is a little bit of we wouldn't call it tricky, but it's just a bit of a specialist sort of question, which I'm happy to provide some more pointers to Deborah later at the end of the session. There's a record of all these questions, isn't there? Yeah, okay, great. Right, so let's keep moving. I'll need the control back. Thanks.
Oh,
Yeah, give an example, a different question.
Yeah, she gave the hypothetical example of if she put 100 in, then she got matched 100, and then she was saying she couldn't claim her 100 that they'd contributed.
Again, yeah, I think that's probably more of a take offline one-on-one type conversation. I think just to understand the specifics of the situation.
As a general though, would that be like someone applying to us to do a project and they've got $100,000 grant from the Commonwealth already, and then they're trying to match that with our funds? Is that like the double dipping scenario?
Oh, that we can't match other Commonwealth funds.
Yeah. So along the same.
I suppose granting guidelines are separate for each granting program, but the ones that I've been involved in, tax incentive rebates have been able to be used as matching funds.
Okay.
But again, it would probably depend on, or most likely depend on the granting guidelines of the grant that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the important thing is this is not a grant. So,
Yeah, it's not a grant.
No.
So what I think I'm trying to say is there's a project that CRC are doing and it costs $200,000 and CRC is putting in 100 and business is putting in 100 and they claim that 100. Yes, which is that's kind of the conversation they're having here. Because their contributions to the CRC project.
Yes, and I think that,
So there's an incentive.
Can I take that one on notice too? I think there's some special provisions on the CRC contributions in the R&D tax incentive, which I'll need to just do a little bit of homework on before I get back to you on. Okay, so let's talk about systematic progression of work. This is the back end of the first part of the definition. So this slide is designed to just illustrate the fact that for us to be comfortable that there's a core R&D activity there, we need to be able to either see that you've got a hypothesis in mind by looking at a hypothesis that's been written down, or we need to be able to infer that a hypothesis was held at the point in time activities were conducted. So there's no firm requirement to document a hypothesis. It's useful if you do. And the hypothesis should be more than a statement of aspiration. It should be a statement that talks about how you aim to get to the endpoint you're getting to, which levers are you pulling in order to get to the endpoint you're trying to achieve. So the hypothesis will direct the experimental activities. By looking at the hypothesis, you'll be able to understand what the experiment is. And the experiment will generate technical data or observations, which will then be looked at, observed, and conclusions will be drawn. And if necessary, the hypothesis will be modified and the process will start again, but in a slightly different vein. So that's the systematic progression of work that we're looking for. And the evaluation of the logical conclusion element is that bit that occurs on the side after that cycle, or before, in between cycles, effectively. Okay, so we talked a bit about hypothesis, and hypothesis is a key concept in the R&D tax incentive. It's a word that freaks a lot of people out. If they're not scientists and they don't wear lab coats on a daily basis. Certainly for us, it's a statement that reflects a particular scientific or technical idea and a proposed explanation for a specified set of facts or events. And that sounds a bit gobbledygook. But this last point, I think, is probably, most instructive. It sets out to investigate the relationship between variables. And as I said before, it articulates what's being done to get to the end point that you're seeking to get to. And so there's an example here of sort of an appropriate hypothesis and an insufficient hypothesis. And so the bottom one is what I call an aspirational statement. So the addition of microencapsulated fish oil will result in a more nutritious spread without affecting the quality of the loaves or the integrity of the additive. That's just what you want to achieve. We don't know how that's happening, and you can't look at that and understand what the experiment is. But if you look at the top one, which is the appropriate hypothesis, you can see that there's a lot more detail in there. So they talk about the speed of mixing, and they talk about how the heating process will work. It's a gentle heating process. And they talk about adding the microencapsulated fish oil in a portion-wise manner over a course of 5 to 10 minutes. So there's a temporal element there. And they talk about, the end point being, the avoidance of aggregation of microcapsules in the diet. So you look at that and you can understand what the experiment is. You can understand what's being done to try and get to the end point. And you can infer that, the objective of the project is to, get a more nutritious spread without affecting the quality of the loaves or the integrity of the additive. So that's a sort of like just a single example of, hypothesis that's sort of reasonably satisfactory from our perspective versus what I would call an aspirational statement, which is basically just sort of saying, well, we want to achieve this, and doesn't give anyone any information about how you're going to do it.
Possibly. No, sorry, they're from earlier.
So no questions? Okay. Okay. Can you click in the slide again? Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So the experiment part of the definition, I think experiment takes its normal meaning. We've had some AAT cases and a federal court matter recently, which has talked about the word experiment in our definition. It doesn't do a lot of work. It's just doing something to see what happens. But in the context of the R&D tax incentive, the experiment that we're looking for is the one that's going to test or examine the hypothesis. And again, this is this concept of, if you change one thing, what happens to another thing? And this whole concept that the results of an experiment will prove or disprove the hypothesis. So you can do something and your hypothesis will be either substantiated or you'll be able to prove that hypothesis, or you'll be able to say, well, no, that's not going to work. We thought it was going to work, but it doesn't. So I wouldn't get hung up too much on experiment. It's just conducting that, doing something and seeing what happens type process. So new knowledge. Now, this is the second part of the definition, and there's been some interesting case law on this recently. There was a federal court matter that looked at an R&D tax incentive case, and what it's meant is that we are taking quite a broad view now of what constitutes for the purpose of generating new knowledge. So part B of the definition, which is, we'll just go back, part B of our definition here, down at the bottom line there, that are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge, is, in my view, these days reasonably easy to meet. And the legislation talks about new knowledge being in the form of new or improved materials, products, devices, processes, or services. And this slide talks about not already in the public arena at the time the activities were conducted. I think it's fair to say that our position has softened a little on that now, and that if it's demonstrable that the company itself or the registrant itself didn't know what it was doing when it was doing something, and we can see that it was a new product, process, or service that was being pursued, then it's usually likely to be able to be concluded that the purpose of doing that was to generate new knowledge. And new knowledge is a broad concept, very big concept. And unknown outcome, which we talked about before, is a narrow concept. So the unknown outcome associated with part A of the definition is quite a narrow thing. This is the thing where the competent professional in the field can't determine what's going to happen at the end of what you're proposing to do based on current expertise. The new knowledge that's referred to in part B is a broader thing than that, and can actually be new knowledge that is available to other people in the world, but may just not be available to the company itself that's doing it. So I wouldn't get too hung up on new knowledge, because if you meet part A, you always meet part B.
And you have to meet both? in
Yes.
terms of eligibility?
You have to meet both. It's a cumulative definition. Yeah, I was just going to say something there, but it's fallen from my brain. Okay, so that's part A, part B of the core activity definition. And as you can see, the hardest bit to meet is part A. It's this unknown outcome that is only pursuable by systematic proportional work, where there's a hypothesis and subsequent experimentation, observation, logical conclusion drawing, and evaluation at the end of that. So all of that needs to be evident in a claim. There are some things that are excluded as core R&D activities. Market research, market testing, market development, sales, promotion, prospecting, exploring or drilling for minerals and petroleum, management studies, efficiency surveys. Interestingly, research in social science, arts and humanities is out, so econometrics is out, which is interesting, because there's some, because that's social science, that's business. So business stuff is out. It's a program that's heavily focused on scientific endeavour, and as a result, social science, arts and humanities are out. There was a little bit of a push some years ago by Kim Carr to include humanities research, but it never went anywhere. So we're stuck with the definition as it stands. And these excluded core activities do actually appear in the legislation. So activities to do with patenting or licensing are excluded from being core R&D activities. Activities associated with complying with statutory requirements and standards, or reverse engineering, which is what reproduction of a commercial product process is, or developing, modifying or customizing computer software for internal administration. So all of those things are excluded as core R&D activities.
Sorry, just with those, if that was part of your researching process or an action that you need to carry out and for the activity that was part of your project, would that still be ineligible?
I feel like Dean Hutton from the Curiosity Show. I'm pleased you asked, because these activities those excluded core R&D activities can actually be supporting R&D activities where they are conducted for the dominant purpose of supporting a core R&D activity. And so we'll talk a little bit about supporting R&D activities now. So supporting R&D activities are interesting. They're not quite as sort of inherently interesting as the experiments that are the core R&D activities. But what's interesting about them is that they attract exactly the same subsidy as the core R&D activities. And in many R&D claims, under the R&D Tax Incentive, the supporting R&D activities are larger in cost than the core R&D activities, because you're quite right, preparing to do an experiment, researching to do experiments. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on.
IP licensing. If you do research and then the outcome is to have, licensing IP, that's supporting of the main activity, correct?
Yeah, IP patenting and IP protection is can we come to that in just a second? I'll just do some generic supporting because I've actually got a soft spot for IP protection as a supporting activity, but there is some stuff that you need to know about it. So just to give you the chapter verse on supporting R&D activities, these activities have a direct, close, and relatively immediate relationship to core R&D activities. If you can demonstrate that, then it's a supporting R&D activity. So importantly, these can be activities that occur before, during, or after experiments. So it might be that you need to collect materials to build a prototype. That's before you test the prototype, right? So that's before. It's a supporting activity that comes before an activity. You might need to clean up after each test. That's a supporting R&D activity that occurs during a core R&D activity. And you might need to dispose of the mess or the destroyed prototype at the end of your testing, which would be a supporting R&D activity that would occur after the R&D activity or the core R&D activity. So that's the main test for supporting R&D activities. There's another test which doesn't always apply, but only applies if the activity is one of those excluded core R&D activities, or is related to producing goods and services, or is it activity that does actually produce goods or services? So if, and look, I think in the case of agricultural claims, if the the activity, the results of the experiment is a couple of tons worth of saleable grain or whatever it is, then then certainly the goods or services, producing goods or services comes into it. But it's important to note that the dominant purpose test only applies if it's related to producing goods or services, or it's an excluded core R&D activity. Otherwise, dominant purpose just doesn't apply, and all the supporting R&D activity needs to be is directly and closely, relatively immediately related to a core R&D activity. So we talked about patenting before. I think there's an argument for patenting, potentially patenting prototypes before they're saleable. So, I mean, I think if leakage of IP is a reason that companies are not going to do projects because there's just no point in them continuing to do their projects, then patenting on the way through can be eligible. That's my view. I'll be honest with you, as a department, we're coming to a position on it right now, so I can't give you any great degree of confidence about it. But certainly, patenting saleable product at the end of an R&D process wouldn't be considered eligible.
Yeah.
Yeah. You talked about accessing IP to commence an experiment. That would probably fall into the realm of something called core technology, and the acquisition of core technology to conduct an R&D activity isn't eligible. There's a specific part of the legislation that deals with that. So yeah, I think if it's your own IP that you're creating as part of the project and you need to patent it just so that it doesn't leak out the sides and competitors go and do your project that you were going to do, then I think potentially there's an argument that it's a supporting activity. It's included as an excluded core activity that can be eligible as a supporting activity. So my view is that it was always envisaged that it might, in the right circumstances where it meets both of these tests, it would be an eligible activity. Again, though, I think if I was putting together an R&D tax incentive claim with a lot of patenting costs as envisaged as part of it, I'd probably seek an advanced finding from us about it. And push us on it. And we'll talk about advanced findings in a little bit. How much time have we got now? What are we doing? 2:22. How long have we been here? An hour. Far out. Let's talk about ineligible activities. Okay, so these are the activities that appear on the right-hand side of that graphic. Ineligible ordinary business activities. It's a very big catch-all phrase. Certainly, the ATO sort of talks about ordinary business activities a lot. It's not a concept that appears in writing in the legislation, but if it's if it's just normal trading activities where there's no experimentation occurring as part of that, then clearly it's not an eligible activity. So commercialisation activities to do with building markets for new products and exploring the compatibility of the product for that market is probably not really going to be experimental enough for the R&D tax incentive. This third point's a little bit unneeded, really. I mean, R&D activities outside of the legislative definition, I suppose that's sort of goes without saying. They put whole of product development there because that whole of product development life cycle encompasses activities that are outside that experimental phase. Testing existing solutions, similarly, that's sort of like fitness for purpose testing in my mind. So you've got a problem, you see a range of off-the-shelf solutions to your problem, and then you try them for fitness for purpose. That's not deemed an eligible activity, and clearly supporting activities that are unrelated to a core activity. So I gave you the silly example of a pot plant earlier. So unless it was a nursery type project, if that's the pot plant might not be eligible. So we'll move to record keeping, which is a key element of the program. As I said before, when we were talking about the annual registration and claiming cycle, ideally companies are consciously thinking about the fact that they want to do R&D before they do it. and they're thinking that if they're going to be doing R&D, that they should be claiming the R&D tax incentive, and they should have in mind that they'll need some records to prove that they are actually doing R&D, to rely on when making their self-assessment declaration, and also if they get picked up for a risk review or an audit. So record keeping is a key aspect of the program, and there is a very clear expectation that contemporaneous records are kept of activities as they occur. So that's not like the very second, but it is within very short sort of time after those activities have occurred. You'd expect a file note to be made or observations to be recorded and dated and so on and so forth. And it should set out an organised program of work that was, attempted to solve that problem that was inherent in the hypothesis that was being explored. So the records need to establish eligibility, not just that an activity occurred. So some records will let you know that something's happened, but they won't give you enough qualitative information to sort of understand whether or not a hypothesis was in mind at the point in time it was being conducted, whether or not there was observations in the, or whether or not there was testing and data collected as a result of those experiments or that testing, and it won't tell you about what conclusions were drawn about that. So what I'm saying here is that the records that are needed to demonstrate eligible R&D are not just simple invoices that something's been done, but are actually records that have a qualitative nature that we can look at and say, well, okay, yeah, well, just looking at that, I can see that they were trying to explore that relationship, and they were trying to do this and this and this to get to that. Oh, and look at those test results. Yes, on that day they did take these test results. Oh, and look, there's the second iteration of testing that occurred a month later. It's that type of stuff. So, and we're not looking for everything from everyone when we come and have a look. It's a sample-based methodology, but the records are records that have a qualitative aspect to them as well as just a simple sort of simply just evidence that something occurred.
So for anyone who's engaging in a project with us, on a CRC project, they will have quarterly reporting that they submit to us based on numerous different things. Activity-based is around milestone completions, and they also provide supporting documentation that could be lab results, could be finalised report, things like that. Is that record keeping enough, do you think, to suffice the department?
Well, you have to look at it, but it sounds pretty good. I mean, it's better than a lot of companies that don't really, they say they've got the records, but they don't.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean.
But you don't have a template that you...
No, and part of the reason why is that what constitutes R&D in one sector for one company is going to look totally different from what might. So in agriculture it would be totally different to biotech, which would be totally different to materials technology, which would be totally different to, I suppose agriculture might be similar, but we're not really prescriptive about it, and that's a bit frustrating for people because they go, oh, what do you want? And we say, well, we don't really know. But we do sort of know. We know when we see it, and we know when we're not seeing it. But it's so individual for each company that it's difficult to be overly prescriptive. Okay, so that was record keeping, and it's important. That shouldn't cripple the businesses that participate. So we've done the first three parts of this. We've done what is the tax incentive. We've talked about self-assessing eligibility and eligible activities. We'll talk briefly about record keeping. Just very quickly talk about our compliance around technical insurance activities, including what we call findings. Now, when I said at the beginning, this self-assessment regime with the tax incentive program, that's what I meant. When you register, or when companies register on an annual basis, they register on the basis of their own self-assessment. And they believe that they're eligible, they sign up for the program, and then there's no formal determination at that point made about the eligibility of activities that are registered. A finding is a formal determination of eligibility by Innovation Science Australia. We act on behalf of Innovation Science Australia, and we conduct findings of those 5 types. Now, an advanced finding is probably the most useful one for participants who are uncertain about whether or not their activities are eligible. It's open for participants to apply to us within the year that they are conducting those activities for an advanced finding about those activities. They will tell us something about it. Part of the process is that we would get in touch with them, potentially ask some more questions, seek whatever documentation might be available, acknowledging that things are still, in train and potentially not complete yet, and make a determination about whether or not the activities were eligible. We'll then issue a certificate of eligibility, or if they're unlucky, certificate of non-eligibility or ineligibility to the company, and provide certainty one way or the other for that company about their activity. So if they were eligible, then they would be able to register them, and that would be a finding that would be binding on the ATO for 3 years. So they could effectively waive that in the face of the ATO if the ATO comes looking and said, well, we don't like your expenses. We'll say, well, no, our industry says they're eligible. So that's that provides certainty of funding. And certainly for companies that are seeking to put the R&D tax incentive into the mix as far as their financing strategy is concerned, and advanced funding is very, very useful to show other financiers that the R&D tax incentive funding is something that can be relied on. So that's an advanced funding. And overseas funding is the same thing, but about activities that are conducted overseas. And that's mandatory if you want to claim an overseas activity. So any companies that want to do overseas activities are welcome to do so, as long as they're eligible activities and they've got a significant scientific link to an Australian core activity, and as long as the overseas expenditure is less than half of the related expenditure. I think there's a slide on that coming up, but no, I don't think there is. I think there is.
On the advanced finding, if that's deemed ineligible, can that be reversed?
But yeah, there's avenues of appeal available. Yes, so we have an internal review process, and if the company is still unhappy about that, they can take it to the AIT and beyond that to the federal court. So pre-registration and post-registration findings are things that would happen on Oz Industries' of our own volition. We would potentially look at a registration coming through the registration process and go, oh, this looks like someone's experimenting with a sort of like a hexagonal shaped donut hole. That's not eligible, and we might approach the company and do a pre-registration finding. Equally, we might be concerned about a company that has registered and do a post-registration finding. They would also end up in a formal determination of eligibility. Core technology is something that we mentioned earlier, and that's finding about whether or not certain technology or IP is a core technology and cannot be claimed. So, as I said before, if it's pre-existing intellectual property and it's already been established and is known about and is part of the project, the uncertainty associated with that is so low that it's not claimable. So the take home from that is you don't really particularly want a core technology finding. Okay, so advanced and overseas findings, just to look at these because they're a little more useful for our participants. So advanced findings looks at the eligibility of Australian-based activities. Overseas finding looks at the eligibility of activities overseas conducted overseas. As I said, overseas activities to be eligible for registration need to be covered by an advanced finding, which is part of the process. They need to be eligible core or eligible supporting activities in their own right. They need to have a significant scientific link to at least one Australian core R&D activity. They must be unable to be conducted in Australia for one of 5 specific reasons, such as can't get access to this expertise, can't get access to the population of test subjects.
Piece of equipment.
Yeah, equipment, etc., etc. So there's 5 reasons that exist in the legislation that you need to meet one of, and then, as I said earlier, the overseas activity expenditure needs to be less than the related Australian activity expenditure. So if people or businesses are sort of approached by us, this is the process. It's a process that's full of natural justice, procedural fairness. There's lots of opportunities for response. We'll provide 30 days plus an extension for people to provide evidence that they've done R&D, and at that point, during that process, we'd most commonly conduct a meeting or a teleconference or a video conference to try and better understand the nature of the activities that have been claimed, and then our process concludes with quite commonly a decision to discontinue the finding and potentially provide some education, or if the registered activities are really sort of having a bit of a lend and the company on the other end is too, then we exercise our discretion to issue a negative finding and disallow the claim. So that's our compliance process in a very small nutshell. Common mistakes with the program, not understanding the eligibility criteria for the application. So that's sort of assuming that sort of layperson R&D is R&D, and not understanding that it's a pretty tight definition. You need to be clear about what you're registering before you register it. Unknown outcome not being related to the hypothesis is a common problem. Unknown outcome not being tested on a worldwide basis. Mistaking tests for hypothesis-driven experiments. So, for example, say you're doing a project that includes drilling into the ground and testing for contaminants in the soil. That's a program of testing, and that is not hypothesis-driven experimentation. And the reason it's not hypothesis-driven experimentation, as per the legislation, is because you're applying a known testing technique. The only thing you don't know is, the chemical properties of the sample that you're actually testing. I mean, if you wanted to use that as a bar to measure R&D, then every person testing their chlorine in their pool would be able to make an R&D claim. So let's not mistake tests for hypothesis-driven experimentation. Rather, the issue is not keeping contemporaneous documentation, also registering the entire project instead of eligible activities, not actually taking the time to go, okay, well, what's directly related to this experiment? And then relying on advice from a third party rather than sourcing their own information from the website or from ourselves, via an advanced project, even via a direct approach to us, to our hotline or to the R&D Tax Incentive staff within our organisation.
So you'd have liaison officers that organisations or companies could engage with to work through. We've got a staff of around 70 nationwide that work on the R&D Tax Incentive in terms of customer engagement and integrity assurance. And businesses are welcome to access our hotline in 2846 to get level 1 support. And if they want level 2 support, they can say, please put me through to an R&D Tax Incentive specialist, and they'll come through to us.
Right. Oh, likewise, you've got Kay and I in Townsville, and then Debbie in Bundaberg, covers Central Queensland, and you've got Tim Hill up in the Northern Territory, and Barry Clark in Broome, covering Northern WA. So there's also some people on the ground that, similar to the hotline, we can do the basic support, and then when questions get tricky, call in time.
So a couple of the questions that have already been asked today are sort of in the tricky basket that would come to us. And so, certainly we are available to consult, but we can't provide advice on whether or not something's eligible. If you want that, you need to do an advanced finding. ICT projects, well, I suppose, I'm not sure that the audience here is a full-blown ICT audience as they can be in some forums. But these common mistakes are common across sectors too. Again, claim for whole projects, not individual activities, failing to identify a specific unknown. There's the contemporaneous documentation appeared again, and claiming for activities related to development of internal administration software. That's out whatever sector you're in. So registering is a matter of hopping onto our website. And I'm just going to drive everyone around the website just for a little bit after we've finished here. You can get more information from both business.gov.au, where I'm going to take you now, and also the ATO. And there's the Entrepreneurs Program and a program that we all know and love, the CRC program. So yeah, there's a question slide. I don't know, perhaps, Madam, how much time have we got? Do we do questions now before we do the website?
Do you want to? How about we do the website first?
Okay,
I think
that's
that might answer.
probably a good idea. I doubt that it's going to answer heaps of questions, but at least it will provide people with a place to go to sort of satisfy their curiosity after today's session is concluded.
do you want to grab the website up and then we'll do?
Okay.
So do you want to start from here?
Yep, that'd be great, yeah. You take everyone from the top level.
Yep. So that one.
Yeah, super. All right. Okay, so this is recently redone business.gov.au webpage. It's taken me as a user a little bit of time to get used to it, but I accessed it on my mobile phone the other day and found it really quite good from a mobile device, which was a strange thing for me to think, because I had always been quite down on their website for quite some time. And they've done some really good work to sort of bring it into the modern era. So the way I get to the R&D Tax Incentive, I mean, you can get through, no thanks. You can get there through grants and programs if you wish, but I just put R&D in with an ampersand in there, and it's the first thing that comes up, which is wonderful. So,
It's open.
Hey?
It's open.
Yeah, it is open. It's permanently open. It's permanently open for applications. So this is the basically the landing page for the R&D Tax Incentive, and we've got the menu here on the left, which basically is what this is down here on the bottom part of this page here. But what I wanted to show you was just the application link, and then some information that was relevant to the agriculture sector. So you go to apply here, and then you apply now here, and it takes you to a sort of hesitate to call it a smart form, and you download a form, and each year you've got to download a fresh form and re-lodge it, and you go through the motions from this page here, which I won't do now, but that's where you get the application form from. On the left-hand side, there's sort of some high-level sort of titles here. So eligibility, we've run through that today. We've talked about overseas and advanced findings, talked about getting it right. Examinations is our formal compliance process. If you're interested, there's some customer stories. I would actually direct you to them. So there's some more customer stories. So,
is that about the process from where to go? So their whole experience?
No, but there's just a couple of case studies of customers that have accessed the program and how it's helped them. Yeah, and you'll get a feel for what type of work that they've done. So there's a couple in agriculture, 3 in biotech, 1 in built environment, a couple in energy, few in manufacturing. So just draw attention to them. But what I also wanted to show folks was the special guidance that's available for people in the agriculture sector. And that's available down here in this area here, help guides and resources for the R&D Tax Incentive. Extra information, again, highly exciting. Program use and updates, but this is where you start getting sector-based guidance provided. So if we click here, we can see that there's a case study, which I'd encourage people to watch. It's a little bit dated now in terms of just its style, and there's a very outdated Oz Industry logo in there, but the concepts are very quite valid and quite current. And there is some specialised guidance here. So Agri-Food and the R&D Tax Incentive, there's a fact sheet available here, which provides a fair bit of detail in an agri-food context about the program. So, oops, there we go. And so just this one here, applying the law, this is actually a real case that occurred that we've de-identified. And so that one is a case of where these activities were for operational purposes. So the facts. Company that operated a wheat farm undertook an activity to test the effects of different liquid lime inputs on germination, root growth, and soil pH. It also aimed to determine the effect of a liquid lime product on high levels of aluminium in soil. And so that was the conclusion that was drawn. So, but it's just an example of some actual decisions that have been made. I mentioned whole of farm claims before. This is a case study on a whole of farm claim, so I'd encourage people to read that. this is a question that's relevant to agriculture, feedstock adjustments. And then there's just a general advice product there on getting R&D tax incentive claims right. So there's a bit of agriculture or agri-food focused guidance available on the website, and I would encourage people to have a look at it. The taxpayer alerts are sort of quite dry and boring, but there is one on agricultural activities, and that's a joint ATO product, ATO Oz industry product. And again, you know, it looks like it's a through a minute, but it would certainly be very, very useful for businesses that are seeking to claim in this space. So that's just a bit of a feel for the information that's available on our website, and we are reliant on businesses and their advisors to inform themselves of this information to the extent that they can, and in the same way as we all do for our income tax returns each year. Just, you know, exercise your best endeavours to inform yourself about what's eligible and what's not before you know, you press the go button on an application. So I suppose that's sort of it in terms of the structured element of the presentation. If we've got questions that we might be able to address, certainly I would just put an apology out there straight away. There may be some that I have to take on notice, but certainly happy to try and explore the questions that have come in.
Okay, so there's two ways we can do this, everyone. We can either do the Q&A or the chat. So we've got access to both of those. So I guess the floor is open now if anyone has any questions.
So we were coming back to that question, is that right?
No, we answered that, didn't we?
Essentially, CRC contributions can be a notional deduction according to the ATO rules.
Yep.
So it will come down to whether it's an eligible activity or an eligible grouping of activities. If that helps answer that one.
Yeah. And so I suppose you couldn't say any more specifically than that. The test would apply to the activities that have been conducted in conjunction with the CRC. Okay, so have we got any new ones?
No.
Perhaps not.
You were that good, Tom.
Well, I'm not sure. There was a couple there that I haven't answered yet. So this one from Marie. I assume we have Marie's email address and so on, and contact details, so we're able to field that query and get that responded to. That question around the sort of special purpose vehicle, for want of a better word, that's the interesting question. I'd like to explore that.
Yeah, don't have any other.
And if there are no other questions, I suppose it's useful for me to thank everyone for their attention and wish them luck with their research and development activities, because, as I said, originated before, it really is, you know, essential for Australia to pursue new sources of competitive advantage to ensure that it remains relevant in the global economy. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, everybody. And if you have any other follow-up questions that you may think of, you're welcome to email through to us at the CRC&A. We can direct you through to Oz Industry, or yeah, happy for you guys to connect directly as well. Yeah. Thanks everyone for your time. Thanks everyone.